What if the very freedom one fought for could be stripped away by the same system you managed to beat? The question resonates deeply when exploring the little-known and often misunderstood history of black slave owners in the United States. It's a history of survival, contradiction, and power, revealing how a small number of free black men and women navigated an oppressive system to secure freedom, wealth, and sometimes, ironically, a measure of social status. In a time of unyielding racial discrimination, some free black individuals in the 18th and 19th centuries not only owned land, but also owned enslaved people, many of whom were family members they had purchased to protect. Yet their success was precarious, vulnerable to a society where even the most affluent black citizens were at risk of having their lives upended by white neighbors, hostile laws, and a legal system stacked against them. The story of black slave owners in America begins in the southern states where, despite harsh restrictions, a small number of black individuals managed to accumulate wealth, secure property, and sometimes acquire enslaved people. Estimates show that in the 1830s and 1840s, thousands of free black individuals owned slaves, though the motivations behind their ownership varied widely. By the 1860s, approximately 3,000 black slaveholders collectively owned around 10,000 slaves, primarily in states like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Virginia. But what led them to own slaves? For the majority, the answer was a deeply personal one. Family. Enslaved family members lived with the constant threat of being sold away from each other, especially in southern states where the laws made it almost impossible for freed family members to simply free enslaved relatives. In many cases, free black individuals purchased their family members to shield them from the broader slave market. These family-owned slaves were, in reality, people seeking legal security for their loved ones in a society that would otherwise rip them apart. Legal restrictions often required that black owners could not simply free their family members at will. Owning them on paper was often the most feasible form of protection. Yet there were also black slave owners who participated in the institution of slavery for economic gain, buying enslaved individuals to work on farms or in businesses. The case of William Ellison, a wealthy cotton gin manufacturer in South Carolina, illustrates this complexity. Ellison, himself once enslaved, was born into slavery in 1790 and acquired his freedom as a young adult. He initially learned the trade of a cotton gin maker from his former owner, and with this skill, he was able to start a business that soon grew into a profitable enterprise. Ellison's cotton gin business expanded to include a plantation, and he eventually owned as many as 63 slaves, whom he used to cultivate cotton and expand his land holdings. Ellison's treatment of his slaves was harsh, mirroring the practices of white slaveholders. His slaves worked long hours in the fields, and he imposed strict discipline, seeking maximum productivity from them. Despite his wealth, Ellison faced constant racial hostility. Although a black man with a plantation, he was not regarded as an equal by white society. White workers were reluctant to work for him, though he occasionally managed to employ poor whites who would take jobs on his terms when options were scarce. Ellison faced significant barriers in protecting his assets, as local authorities and white neighbors eyed his success with suspicion. The threat of legal actions and land seizures loomed over his estate, and maintaining ownership of his land and slaves required navigating a biased legal system that would quickly turn against him. Antoine Dubuclet of Louisiana presents another side of this complex history. Dubuclet, born in 1810 to a free black family, was never enslaved, but he lived under the shadow of slavery's restrictions. Through family connections and careful business dealings, he gradually amassed wealth in the sugar industry. Dubuclet married a wealthy black woman, and the two combined their resources to purchase more land and enslaved people, eventually owning over 100 slaves. His wealth positioned him as one of the wealthiest black men in the South before the Civil War, and he treated his enslaved workers as an economic investment, adhering to the practices of other wealthy slaveholders to ensure productivity on his sugar plantation. Dubuclet's story, however, took a dramatic turn after the Civil War. With the Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent abolition of slavery, Dubuclet, like Ellison, lost the legal right to own slaves, which significantly impacted his sugar business. After the war, many of his former assets were difficult to hold on to, as Reconstruction policies and societal hostility made it increasingly challenging for black landowners. While he retained some land, he struggled under the pressures of hostile white neighbors and racial restrictions, and his wealth was considerably reduced. In the end, the vast assets he had built through a lifetime of strategic planning and labor exploitation were significantly diminished, leaving his family with only a fraction of the property he once controlled. The precarious position of black slave owners is best understood in the context of the legal and social constraints that hemmed them in. In a society that strictly categorized individuals by race, black slave owners faced threats from all sides, particularly from a legal system that could strip them of their property at any moment. Owning slaves, even if for family protection, was not a guarantee of safety. Indeed, black slave owners were often regarded with suspicion by white neighbors who saw their success as a threat to the social order. Laws in southern states were notoriously unforgiving when it came to property rights for free black people. Any free black person who owned land, slaves, or other assets was constantly at risk of having their property seized through legal maneuvers or outright coercion. White landowners who envied their black neighbors' success had powerful allies in a legal system that was stacked against free blacks. Courts routinely sided with white plaintiffs in disputes, leaving black property owners vulnerable to losing everything they had built. Often the reasons for land or property seizure were flimsy, relying on technicalities that would be dismissed if the owner were white. The Civil War added another layer of insecurity. Both Confederate and Union forces were known to confiscate land and slaves as resources for their respective causes, and black owners were far less likely to have their property returned after the war. Even when ownership was retained, the post-war era, particularly during Reconstruction, brought new challenges. White communities were resentful of any black prosperity, and white neighbors frequently harassed black landowners, using violence or legal maneuvers to force sales at reduced prices. The Emancipation of 1865 ended legal slavery, but it also left former black slave owners in a precarious position. Without the labor structure they once relied on, those who had operated plantations found themselves struggling to adjust. Unlike white plantation owners, many of whom retained significant wealth or received compensation in various forms, black slave owners had fewer options and often lacked the political connections or capital to survive the economic upheaval. During Reconstruction, black landowners faced persistent threats from white neighbors and local governments. Many were coerced into selling land at steep losses, forced to abandon their properties under threat of violence, or bankrupted by the discriminatory economic restrictions of the black codes. While former white slave owners were able to re-establish themselves under new economic arrangements, black landowners faced harsher challenges, with the loss of enslaved labor compounded by unrelenting racial discrimination and financial exclusion. In many ways, the end of slavery did not equate to the freedom and prosperity that black landowners hoped to secure. The violence, intimidation, and legal manipulation they faced only intensified in the years following the war. Land that should have been a legacy of their perseverance was often stripped away, leaving black families with little to pass down to future generations. This loss of property, wealth, and stability was a blow that would resonate for generations, contributing to the racial wealth gap that persists to this day. The history of black slave owners in America is a powerful story of survival within an oppressive system. It reveals the lengths to which individuals went to protect family, secure wealth, and carve out a semblance of stability within a society built on their marginalization. For many black slave owners, owning slaves was not about perpetuating oppression, but rather about resisting it, about finding ways to protect family members in a society that would otherwise separate them. For others, it was about embracing a system to gain status, wealth, and protection in an environment where few such paths were available. Yet this history is also a reminder of how precarious black success has been in America. The achievements of black slave owners, no matter how significant, were always vulnerable to the whims of a society that refused to recognize their equality. Their land, slaves, and wealth could be, and often were, taken from them, sometimes by force, other times through legal means that worked against them. The era following emancipation only reinforced these disparities, as formerly enslaved black individuals and even free black landowners faced insurmountable barriers to reclaiming or preserving their property. In the end, the history of black slave owners in America is a story that reveals both the resilience and the relentless injustices endured by black communities. It shows how black individuals navigated a brutal system, sometimes finding success, only to see it stripped away. Today, the legacies of these individuals stand as a testament to the resilience of black Americans, and a sobering reminder of how deeply racial discrimination was woven into the very fabric of American society. This legacy is one we continue to confront as we seek to understand and address the inequalities that remain entrenched, a reminder that justice delayed has lasting consequences for generations.